the morning of April 7th, 1812. Dawn breaks over the scarred, smoking ruins of the fortress of Badajoz on the border of Spain and Portugal. The air is thick with the smell of gunpowder, sulphur, and death. General Arthur Wellesley, the first Earl of Wellington, rides towards the breaches, his staff officers trailing in grim silence. What he sees will break the iron composure of the man known as the Iron Duke. He stops, looking down at the great breach in the Trinidad bastion. It is not a ramp of rubble. It is a mound of human bodies, piled 3 and 4 men deep, a hideous rampart of the dead. Men of his elite Light and 4th Divisions, their red coats stained dark crimson and black, are fused together in a grotesque mass of congealed blood and shattered limbs. 5,000 of his best men are gone, struck down in a single night. The Allied commander, a man famously stoic, removes his hat. He cannot speak. The tears stream down his face. He would later write, "The capture of Badajoz affords as strong an instance of the gallantry of our troops as has ever been exhibited. But I greatly hope that I shall never be the instrument of putting them to such a test again." This was his most costly victory. This was the storming of Badajoz. To understand the carnage, one must understand the stakes. By the spring of 1812, the Peninsular War was a brutal, bleeding stalemate. Wellington, commanding the Allied Anglo-Portuguese army, had secured Portugal. But to advance into Spain, he had to control the great key fortresses on the border. He had already taken Ciudad Rodrigo in the north. Now, he needed Badajoz in the south. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of his supply lines, a fortress that had already repulsed him twice. This time, he would not be repulsed. On March 16, 1812, Wellington's army, numbering some 27,000 men, arrived before the walls, and the siege began. Time was his greatest enemy. Wellington was not operating in a vacuum. 2 powerful French armies were on the move. From the south, Marshal Soult was marching to relieve the fortress. From the north, Marshal Marmont was doing the same. Wellington was caught in a strategic vice. He could not wait for a leisurely, formal siege. He could not starve the garrison out. He had to take Badajoz, and he had to take it now. He had to punch a hole in the walls with his cannons and send his men, with bayonets and sheer courage, into the breach. He was gambling. He was gambling that the unmatched fighting spirit of his British redcoats and Portuguese allies could overwhelm a fortress that, by all military logic, was unbreachable. It was a gamble that would be paid for, by the pint, with the blood of his finest soldiers. The clock was ticking, and every day the French relief armies marched closer. Wellington ordered the trenches dug and the great guns brought forward. The countdown to the bloodiest assault of the war had begun. Inside the walls of Badajoz, the garrison was not idle. They were not waiting passively for the inevitable. Their commander was a man of extraordinary talent and grim determination. Général de Brigade Armand Philippon. Philippon was not just a soldier. He was a brilliant military engineer. He commanded a garrison of approximately 5,000 French and Hessian troops, and he intended to make Wellington pay for every inch of ground. He knew his fortress was strong. The massive stone walls, the deep ditches, and the powerful bastions were formidable. But Philippon was about to elevate the defense of Badajoz from a simple obstacle into a masterpiece of military engineering, a perfectly designed killing ground. He would turn the fortress into a death trap. From March 17th, Wellington's men began the back-breaking and lethal work of opening the trenches. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of soldiers dug zigzagging lines of earthworks, creeping closer and closer to the fortress walls. This was the essential, unglamorous work of any siege. The goal was to dig protected positions close enough for the heavy siege cannons to be brought up, safe from the French guns on the ramparts. But at Badajoz, nothing was safe. Philippon's artillery was well served and aggressive. French snipers, perched on the walls, picked off any man who showed his head. Every night, French raiding parties would sally from the gates, storming the trenches with bayonets, killing the diggers, and sabotaging the works before melting back into the darkness. The siege was less than a week old, and already the butcher's bill was growing. Wellington's first major objective was an outer fortification, a strongpoint called Fort Picarina. This fort was detached from the main city, and its cannons provided a flanking fire that made it impossible for the British to dig their trenches near the main walls. It had to be taken. For several days, from March 17th to the 25th, British guns pounded the fort. Then, the assault was ordered. In what was a chilling preview of the main event, British and Portuguese troops stormed the outwork. The fighting was hand-to-hand, desperate and bloody. It was a mini Badajoz, a brutal affair that cost Wellington over 300 casualties just to take this single strongpoint. But its capture was vital. With Fort Picarina in Allied hands, the real work could begin. On March 30th, the main event started. The British heavy guns, the 18-pounders and massive 24-pounders, were finally wrestled into their prepared positions. The battering train was ready. With a deafening, rolling thunder, the bombardment of Badajoz itself began. The cannon's targets were not random. Wellington's engineers had identified the weakest points. The fire was concentrated on 3 specific bastions on the eastern side of the fortress: the Trinidad Bastion, the Santa Maria Bastion, and the smaller San Roque Bastion. Day after day, the heavy iron balls smashed into the centuries-old stone. The sound was relentless, a continuous, deafening roar that shook the very ground. Slowly, the thick walls began to crumble. Stone dust filled the air. Gaps appeared. Then, great sections of the wall collapsed into the ditch below, forming sloping ramps of rubble. The breaches were open. From the British trenches, the way into Badajoz now seemed clear. But for General Philippon, this was not a failure. It was the next phase of his plan. The British had opened the doors, and now he would set the trap. From the British lines, the breaches looked like victory. The great stone faces of the Trinidad and Santa Maria bastions had been pulverized. Where once stood sheer 30-foot walls, there were now 3 wide, sloping ramps of rubble. They were steep, they were choked with debris, but they were ramps nonetheless. To the battle-hardened redcoats of the 4th and Light Divisions, who had been chosen for the main assault, it looked like a straightforward, if brutal, race to the top. They believed the primary obstacles were the 5,000 French soldiers waiting for them with musket and bayonet. They were tragically mistaken. The primary obstacle was not the men, it was the mind of General Philippon. In the days between April 5th and the night of the 6th, as the British bombardment continued, Philippon's men worked with a desperate, ingenious fury. They did not try to rebuild the stone wall. They let the British have their ramps. Instead, they worked behind the breaches, on the intact ramparts just above the rubble. They were constructing a new, far more lethal line of defense. The centerpiece of this defense was a medieval-sounding weapon, repurposed for 19th century warfare, the cheval de frise. This was not a simple barricade. Philippon's men took heavy beams, long logs, and even cart axles, and chained them together. Into these beams, they drove and fixed a dense, interlocking forest of razor-sharp sword blades, bayonets, and broken pikes, all pointing outwards and downwards. This was a horizontal porcupine, an immovable 10-foot-high wall of steel spikes, perfectly designed to snag, impale, and halt a charging column of men. This cheval de frise was winched into place and chained down at the very top of each breach, right where the rubble slope met the rampart, hidden from British view. But this was only the first layer of the trap. In the rubble slopes themselves, French engineers buried dozens of feu gases, large barrels of gunpowder and shells, all linked to detonating fuses. The ramps the British were so eager to climb were, in fact, gigantic landmines. On the ramparts flanking the breaches, Philippon positioned his artillery. The cannons were not loaded with solid shot to smash walls, but with canister. These were simple tin cans, packed with hundreds of musket balls. When fired, they turned a cannon into a massive fortress-sized shotgun capable of obliterating dozens of men with a single blast. Stockpiles of grenades, fireballs of pitch-soaked rags, and loaded muskets were piled high for the defenders, who were positioned in specially built trenches and firing steps. Even the approach was a death trap. Philippon had dammed the nearby Revillas stream, flooding the deep ditches in front of the walls. Any soldier unlucky enough to fall would find himself in 5 feet of water, weighted down by his 60-pound pack, unable to climb out. By the evening of April 6th, the trap was set. Philippon had conceded the breaches. He no longer intended to defend the wall, he intended to defend the entry. He had transformed the gaping holes in his fortress not into weak points, but into meticulously engineered funnels of death. They were channels, designed to pack Wellington's finest troops into a compressed, helpless mass, and then annihilate them with fire, steel, and explosives from all sides. The breaches were not doors, they were jaws, and as darkness fell, they were waiting to close. As darkness fell on April 6, 1812, an eerie silence settled over the British lines. The relentless, ground-shaking thunder of the 18 and 24-pounder siege cannons, which had pounded the city for 7 days, finally ceased. For the men waiting in the forward trenches, this silence was more terrifying than the noise. It meant the time had come. Tonight, the fortress would be taken not with iron, but with flesh and blood. Wellington had committed nearly 18,000 men to the assault. This was not a probing attack. It was an all-or-nothing deluge of manpower, hurled against what French General Philippon had made into the most formidable defence in Europe. The tip of this spear was formed from the very best of Wellington's army, the Light Division and the 4th Division. These were his veterans, his hard-as-nails, stormers, men who had fought from the beaches of Portugal to the mountains of Spain. The Light Division, in their dark green jackets, were the elite. They carried the deadly accurate Baker rifle and were masters of skirmish warfare. Tonight, they would be used as a battering ram. Their target, along with the 4th Division, was the main breaches, the gaping, rubble-choked moors of the Trinidad and Santa Maria bastions. They would be the first into the jaws of the trap. But even before these divisions could move, another, smaller group of men had to go first. This was the Forlorn Hope. The name was not a poetic invention. It was a formal, tactical designation for a suicide mission. From each assault division, a small party of volunteers was assembled, perhaps 25 to 100 men, led by a junior officer. Their task was simple: to be the first men into the breach. They were to run ahead of the main column, carrying light ladders, axes, and explosives. Their job was to absorb the first devastating volley of French fire, to draw the enemy's attention, and to try and clear any initial obstacles. The survival rate was known to be almost zero, which is why they were called forlorn. The incentive was not pay, but glory. Any man or officer who survived a forlorn hope was guaranteed promotion. On this night, as they blackened their faces with gunpowder and checked their flints, every man in the Forlorn Hope knew he was likely running to his death. While the main assault force of 8,000 men prepared to storm the breaches, Wellington planned 2 major diversions. These were not mere feints, they were full-scale assaults intended to draw French defenders away. The first was given to the 3rd Division, the Fighting Third, led by the famously aggressive and foul-mouthed Welshman, Major General Thomas Picton. Picton's task was, by any measure, impossible. He was to lead his division in an escalade, a direct assault using 30-foot scaling ladders against the sheer 100-foot-high walls of the ancient castle, the strongest point of the fortress. It was a medieval tactic, a suicidal climb against a fully prepared enemy. On the far side of the town, the 5th Division was given a similar task: to escalade the San Vicente bastion. In the cold, dark trenches, thousands of men stood in packed columns, muskets loaded, bayonets fixed. The air was cold. The only sound was the clink of metal on stone and the quiet, tense murmur of orders. At 22 hours, 10 p.m., the signal was given. The forlorn hope surged into the darkness, and the great storm of Badajoz began. The forlorn hope of the Light and 4th Divisions vanished into the blackness of the ditch, and the main columns surged forward behind them. Thousands of men, formed in dense columns, charged towards the Trinidad and Santa Maria bastions. The French on the ramparts held their fire. They waited, with perfect, chilling discipline, as the British soldiers descended into the great ditch. The first shock was not from a musket ball, but from water. The French had flooded the ditches. Men expecting firm ground plunged into 5 feet of icy, black water. Weighted by their heavy packs and ammunition, those who stumbled or were wounded were pushed under by the press of men behind them. They drowned in the darkness before a shot was even fired at them. Scrambling out of the moat, the columns began their charge up the steep, rubble-strewn slopes of the breaches. And then General Philippon sprung his trap. The night exploded. The breaches, survivors later said, did not look like a fortification. They looked like the mouth of a volcano. From the flanks, the French cannons, loaded with canister shot, fired at point-blank range. These giant shotguns blasted curtains of metal into the packed British columns, shredding the ranks and blowing dozens of men apart with every discharge. The French infantry, safe behind their defences, lit and threw thousands of grenades and fireballs down into the crowd. These explosives rolled and bounced down the rubble, detonating among the struggling soldiers. Then came the mines. As the Light Division, led by Major General James Kempt and Lieutenant Colonel Barnard, reached the centre of the Santa Maria breach, the ground beneath them erupted. Philippon's engineers detonated the massive pre-laid barrels of gunpowder. The explosion was immense, a blinding flash of light that momentarily lit the entire fortress. Hundreds of men were vaporized in an instant, their bodies and limbs thrown high into the air. The sound was a deafening, physical blow that stunned the men who survived. Yet still, the redcoats came on. Fueled by a desperate, almost mad courage, they pushed forward, climbing over the mounds of their own dead and dying, trampling the wounded underfoot. They reached the top. After fighting their way through this hellstorm of fire, steel, and explosives, the leading men crested the summit of the breach. They were met not with French bayonets, but with something far worse, the cheval de frise. In the flickering demonic light of the explosions, they saw it for the first time, an impassable, 10-foot-high wall of interlocking beams, bristling with a dense forest of razor-sharp sword blades. It was a perfect, unbreachable barrier. The British soldiers, with no tools to break it and no way around it, were trapped. They pushed against the blades, hacking at them uselessly with their bayonets, while the French, just feet away, simply levelled their muskets and fired volley after volley into the helpless, struggling mass. It was not a battle, it was a methodical slaughter. For 2 horrific hours, from 10 p.m. until midnight, Wellington fed his best divisions into these funnels of death. The breaches became choked with bodies, piled so high that they formed a ramp of their own. The attack on the main breaches had failed. It had failed completely, and it had cost thousands of lives. As the Light and 4th Divisions were being systematically annihilated at the main breaches, a separate, equally desperate battle was raging less than half a mile away. This was the diversion, the assault on the castle, led by the indomitable Major General Thomas Picton. Picton was a legend in the army, a battle-hardened, foul-mouthed Welshman known for his sheer, uncontrolled aggression. His 3rd Division, the Fighting Third, adored him and would follow him anywhere. Tonight, anywhere was the base of the castle's 100-foot-high sheer stone walls. Their task was an escalade, a tactic that belonged more to the medieval age than to the era of gunpowder. They carried no cannons, no explosives, only 30-foot scaling ladders, their muskets, and their bayonets. The plan was, on its face, suicidal. The ladders were too short to reach the top of the ramparts in a single go. They would have to be placed on a narrow crumbling ledge, or berm, partway up, and then hauled up again for a second climb, all while under a hail of fire from the French defenders above. Picton, never one for subtlety, led his men into the darkness of the castle ditch. The attack began almost simultaneously with the assault on the breaches. The French were ready. As the 3rd Division advanced, the castle ramparts exploded in a sheet of flame. Musketry, grenades, and heavy stones rained down on the attackers. The British troops rushed forward, planting their heavy ladders against the ancient walls. The leading men, many from the forlorn hope of the 3rd Division, began the terrifying vertical climb. Captain James McCarthy of the 50th Regiment was reportedly among the first, embodying the desperate courage of the attack. It was a nightmare. The French defenders leaned over the parapets, firing their muskets directly down into the faces of the climbing men. They used their long pikes to push the ladders, heavy with soldiers, away from the wall. A fully laden ladder tilting backwards would topple over with a horrific crash, sending a dozen men plunging to their deaths in the ditch below. Rocks, logs, and exploding fireballs were hurled down, smashing skulls and scattering the attackers. General Picton himself, raging at the base of the wall and urging his men forward, was struck by a musket ball and fell, severely wounded. For a moment, the attack faltered. The losses were horrific. The ladders were too few, and the fire was too intense. But the 3rd Division was forged in Picton's image. They would not break. Seeing their general fall, a wave of cold fury seemed to possess them. They came on again, planting ladders, climbing, falling, and climbing again. A foothold was gained. A few men, led by McCarthy, scrambled over the parapet. More followed. A vicious, hand-to-hand melee erupted on the ramparts. The French, fighting desperately, counterattacked. The small group of British attackers was pushed back, almost thrown from the walls, but the breach, however small, had been made. The fighting 3rd, roaring with rage and exertion, now swarmed up the secured ladders. They did not wait to form up. They poured over the wall, a wave of bayonets. The French defenders, now hopelessly outnumbered on this section of the wall, broke and fled into the darkness of the castle's interior. Against all odds, against all military logic, Picton's diversion had succeeded. The 3rd Division had clawed its way into the highest and strongest point of the fortress. They had captured the castle of Badajoz. They were inside, and in doing so, they had just changed the fate of the entire battle. While the 3rd Division was fighting its desperate battle for the castle on one side of Badajoz, and the Light and 4th Divisions were being slaughtered at the breaches in the centre, Wellington's 2nd diversion was in motion on the far western side of the town. Here, the 5th Division, under General Leith, was tasked with its own escalade against the towering San Vicente bastion. This was another impossible task. A sheer climb against a well-defended wall, intended solely to draw French reserves away from the main fight. But, like Picton's attack, it would become a war-winning breakthrough. The 5th Division's assault was a mirror image of the 3rd's. They too advanced under a withering fire, carrying their heavy scaling ladders into the deep, dark ditches. The French defenders, though stretched thin by the sheer scale of Wellington's multi-pronged attack, were vigilant. They poured musketry and grenades down onto the attackers, and with pikes and brute force, they shoved the first ladders to be planted away from the walls. Men were crushed as they fell, but the 5th Division was relentless. They were not veterans of the same caliber as the Light Division, but they had a stubborn, steady courage. They found a section of the wall, an escarp, that was slightly lower. They planted their ladders in a great cluster, swarming them in such numbers that the French defenders simply could not kill them fast enough. After a bloody, protracted struggle in the darkness, the 5th Division also gained a foothold. A small party got over the parapet, followed by a company, then a battalion. They had broken in. It was now just after midnight on April 7th. A strategic miracle had occurred, one that Wellington had not dared to count on. Both of his diversionary ladder assaults, the two most suicidal and unlikely parts of his plan, had succeeded. The main assault, the one he had pinned all his hopes on, had failed catastrophically. But it no longer mattered. He now had thousands of British troops inside the fortress. on opposite ends of the town. General Philippon, the brilliant French governor, now faced an unsolvable crisis. His defences at the breaches had performed perfectly. They had held. They had shattered Wellington's finest divisions. But now Philippon was being attacked from within his own walls. The 3rd Division, having secured the castle, was rampaging down into the town from the east. The 5th Division, having stormed the San Vicente bastion, was now pushing in from the west. The 5,000 French defenders were caught in a classic pincer movement. The very men who had been so bravely repelling the attack at the Trinidad and Santa Maria bastions suddenly heard gunfire and British cheers behind them. They were trapped. Their disciplined defence collapsed into a desperate fight for survival. Attacked from the rear by Picton's men and from the front by a renewed, desperate surge from the remnants of the 4th Division, the French garrison at the breaches finally broke. By 2:01 a.m., the battle was effectively over. The surviving British troops from the main assault, finally pouring through the now undefended breaches, linked up with the 3rd and 5th Divisions. Badajoz had fallen. The surviving French, including Philippon, who had fought to the last, retreated to the safety of the Fort San Cristobal across the river, surrendering the next morning. The fortress was Wellington's, but the victorious army, which had just achieved the impossible, was about to descend into an infamy that would shame it forever. As the last scattered shots of the battle faded and the French garrison broke, a new dreadful sound began to rise from the city. It was not the cheer of victory. It was a roar. It was the sound of 18,000 men, pushed past the limits of human endurance, their discipline shattered by the sheer concentrated horror of the night. The surviving troops, their faces blackened by gunpowder, their uniforms stiff with the blood of their comrades, were possessed by what survivors called a half-mad, half-drunken fury. For 2 hours, they had been systematically butchered in the breaches. They had watched thousands of their friends and brothers blown apart, impaled and incinerated. Now, the dam of military discipline did not just crack, it was obliterated. The sack of Badajoz had begun. The city of Badajoz was not an enemy. It was a Spanish city, an ally. Its people were Spanish civilians, the very people the British army was supposedly there to liberate. None of it mattered. The soldiers who poured through the breaches and over the walls saw only a prize to be taken, a place to vent the rage and terror of the assault. Their first targets were the wine and brandy shops. Casks were rolled into the streets, their tops smashed open with musket butts. Soldiers, already half insane with adrenaline and powder fume, drank from their helmets, from their shakos, or lapped directly from the gutters running with alcohol. Within an hour, a large part of Wellington's victorious army was a drunken, raging mob. Then, the true horror was unleashed. All control was lost. Junior officers, who had bravely led the forlorn hope just hours before, now found their threats and pleas completely ignored. Some were even shot at by their own men. The soldiers fanned out into the city streets, and hell followed with them. They smashed down the doors of houses, seeking loot, alcohol, and women. What followed was not war. It was an orgy of uncontrolled violence. Houses were ransacked, their furniture thrown from windows and piled onto bonfires in the squares. Priceless heirlooms, church silver, and personal belongings were stolen, fought over, and destroyed. But the lust for plunder quickly descended into something far darker. The soldiers, maddened by their losses and inflamed by drink, turned on the civilian population. Men, women, and children were cut down in the streets. Spanish citizens who tried to defend their homes were bayoneted without a second thought. Hundreds were murdered. And then came the worst of it. The sack of Badajoz became a story of mass rape. For 72 hours, the women of the city were hunted. No one was safe, from young girls to old women. They were dragged from their homes, from churches where they had sought sanctuary, and brutalized, often by dozens of men, often in full view of their murdered families. The city's bells, which had rung in alarm at the start of the assault, now tolled over a scene of utter depravity. Officers wept in frustration and shame, powerless to stop the thousands of men who had, in an instant, turned from heroes into monsters. The 72-hour aftermath had begun, and it would become one of the darkest, most shameful episodes in the history of the British Army. The sun rose on April 7th, but it brought no end to the nightmare. The light merely illuminated the full scale of the depravity. What had been a disciplined, professional army just 12 hours before had completely dissolved. Badajoz was now a city ruled by its conquerors, and their rule was one of terror. The scenes in the streets beggared belief. Soldiers, their red coats torn and stained, their faces still black with the gunpowder from the assault, staggered through the squares in drunken gangs. They fired their muskets randomly into the air, or at windows, or at stray animals. The city was a cacophony of random gunfire, the splintering of doors, the crash of breaking glass, and the constant piercing screams of the civilian population. The officers were utterly powerless. This was a complete breakdown of the chain of command from the top down. Veteran officers who had commanded these same men in a dozen battles, men who had led them up the scaling ladders just hours before, were now met with open defiance. They pleaded, they threatened, they drew their swords. It made no difference. Some officers were simply pushed aside. Others were threatened with bayonets by the very men they had led to victory. A few were even killed by their own troops, shot in the back while trying to intervene in a rape or a murder. The social contract that holds an army together, the bond of trust and discipline between officer and enlisted man, had been consumed in the fires of the breaches and drowned in the casks of looted brandy. For the Spanish civilians, there was no sanctuary. The rampage was indiscriminate. Soldiers, having looted one house, would move to the next, their bloodlust and greed growing with every new atrocity. They carried their plunder with them, sacks of silver, priceless paintings, even strings of jewels worn by women they had just brutalized. They fought each other over the spoils, and drunken brawls would escalate into deadly bayonet fights between comrades. The streets became a hellscape. Bodies lay where they had fallen, Spanish civilians, but also British soldiers, killed by their own side in drunken disputes. Wounded men from the assault, who had dragged themselves from the breaches seeking aid, were forgotten. Some were even trampled by the rioting mob. This was not a brief explosion of violence. It continued, unabated, for a second day, and a third. The city of Badajoz, an allied city, was being systematically destroyed by its liberators. The horror was compounded by this fact. These were not the hated French. These were the Spanish, who had looked to Wellington's army for salvation. Instead, they were subjected to horrors that rivaled the worst excesses of the French armies they were fighting. The 72-hour sack of Badajoz was not just a loss of discipline, it was a profound moral collapse. The army had been shamed, and as reports, carried by horrified and disgusted staff officers, finally reached Wellington at his headquarters outside the city, the Iron Duke was forced to confront a terrible reality. His army, the instrument of his genius, had turned into a monster. He had to act, not as a general, but as an executioner. By the morning of April 9th, 72 hours after the assault had begun, Badajoz was a city in ruins, still in the grip of a drunken and blood-soaked rabble. The rampage had not burned itself out, it was feeding on itself. Reports reaching Wellington's headquarters were so horrific they were almost unbelievable. He was a general who prized, above all else, discipline. It was the foundation upon which his entire army was built, the very thing that he believed separated his redcoats from the conscript hordes of the French. Now, that foundation had crumbled into dust. He had lost control of his army, and in doing so, he had failed the people of Spain. His rage was cold, and his solution was absolute. He could not use British troops to restore order. They were all complicit, either as active participants or as intimidated bystanders. He needed fresh hands, untainted by the blood and alcohol of the sack. He turned to his Portuguese allies, battalions that had been held in reserve and had not taken part in the horrific storming of the breaches. These troops were fresh, they were disciplined, and they were, perhaps most importantly, just as disgusted by the atrocities committed against their Spanish neighbours as Wellington was. They were given their orders. They were not to plead or to negotiate. They were to restore order by any means necessary. A new army now entered Badajoz. Columns of Portuguese soldiers, with bayonets fixed, marched into the city in full battle formation. They advanced through the streets, which were littered with debris, smashed furniture, and the bodies of civilians. They were met by the drunken, stunned remnants of the British divisions. This time, the officers' commands were not requests. They were backed by thousands of loaded muskets. Gallows were erected in the main squares, a clear and brutal message to the rioters. This was not a police action. It was a re-imposition of military law by overwhelming force. The effect was immediate. The half-mad, half-drunken fury of the British soldiers evaporated, replaced by a sullen, fearful, and hungover obedience. Soldiers who, just hours before, had been threatening their own officers with death, now found themselves staring down the formed ranks of the Portuguese infantry. They were rounded up. They were herded like cattle. Regimental provosts moved through the streets, grabbing the worst offenders and dragging them, quite literally, to the gallows. Summary executions began. Men who were caught in the act of looting or violence were flogged on the spot or strung up as an example. Slowly, over the course of the 9th, the screams and gunfire died down. The 3-day reign of terror was over, put down not by the men who started it, but by their allies. The city of Badajoz fell into a stunned, traumatized silence, broken only by the sobbing of its surviving citizens and the barked orders of the Portuguese. As the army was forcibly brought back to heel, Wellington and his officers could finally begin to take stock of what had happened. The first task was grim: to tally the cost. The human price for this victory, a victory that had been won by impossible courage and immediately squandered by unimaginable cruelty, was only just becoming clear. And as the reports came in, the scale of the sacrifice and the scale of the shame became horrifyingly apparent. When the fog of alcohol and bloodlust finally lifted, the true cost of Badajoz was laid bare. It was a price that staggered even the most hardened veterans of the Peninsular War. The task of tallying the casualties began, a grim accounting of the human ledger. The numbers that came back to Wellington's headquarters were, for a single night's work, simply catastrophic. In the course of the entire siege, from the first trenches dug on March 17th to the final, bloody storming, the Allied army had suffered between 4,800 and 5,000 casualties. This was a staggering figure in its own right, but the truly horrifying detail was in the timeline. The vast majority of these losses, some 3,500 men, had been killed, wounded, or gone missing in just a few nightmarish hours on the evening of April 6th. The elite divisions that Wellington had relied upon had been eviscerated. The Light Division and the 4th Division, his stormers, had been thrown into the meat grinder of the breaches and had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist as effective fighting units. They had been shattered, losing nearly half their strength in less time than it took to fight a minor skirmish. In contrast, the French garrison of 5,000 men had inflicted this terrible toll while losing only around 1,500 of their own, with the remaining 3,500 captured. General Philippon had lost his fortress, but he had won his tactical battle, exacting a price in blood so high that it nearly broke the will of the victor. This was the sight that had greeted Wellington on the morning of April 7th. This was the reason for his tears. As he stood at the lip of the Trinidad breach, looking down at the literal mound of his finest soldiers, piled in the ditch and on the rubble, he was not a triumphant conqueror. He was a commander confronting the terrible, almost unbearable consequences of his own calculated gamble. He had gambled that the cold steel of his men could overcome an impossible defense before the French relief armies arrived. He had won that gamble, but only just, and the cost had been his army's best. His words that morning, that he hoped he would never be the instrument of putting them to such a test again, were not a mere platitude. They were the confession of a man who had stared into the abyss of what war demanded, and had been shaken to his core. But this was only the military cost. An even darker accounting had to be made inside the city walls. The exact number of Spanish civilians murdered, raped, and brutalized during the 72-hour sack will never be known. Contemporary accounts speak of hundreds. Entire families were wiped out. The city, which had already endured a brutal siege, was now a traumatized, broken shell, its trust in its liberators utterly and forever destroyed. This was the shame of the army that the title of the video alludes to. It was a stain on the reputation of Wellington's army and on the flag it fought for that would never wash out. It would be remembered long after the strategic importance of the battle had faded. And yet, the strategic importance was undeniable. From a cold military perspective, the capture of Badajoz, for all its horror, was a stunning success. Wellington had taken the key to Spain. With both Ciudad Rodrigo and Badajoz now in his hands, the southern and northern invasion corridors were secure. The French armies of Soult and Marmont had been outmaneuvered and outraced. The path was now open for Wellington to advance into the heart of Spain, a campaign that would lead, just a few months later, to his masterpiece victory at Salamanca. He had achieved his objective. But as the army buried its dead and marched away from the smoking, silent ruins of Badajoz, it was a victory that brought no glory. It was a grim, necessary, and deeply shameful step on the long, bloody road to victory in the peninsula. The army that marched out of Badajoz was not the same army that had arrived a month earlier. It was victorious, but it was also broken, shamed, and profoundly sobered. The 3rd and Light Divisions, the very soul of Wellington's infantry, had to be rebuilt from scratch, their shattered battalions filled with raw replacements who had not seen the horrors of the breaches. The army marched with the plunder of a friendly city stuffed into its knapsacks, a tangible reminder of the moral abyss into which it had fallen. The gallows in the main square stood as a stark monument to the moment the Iron Duke had lost control and the brutal lengths he had to go to regain it. The legacy of Badajoz is therefore a dark and complicated one. It is not remembered with the clean, heroic pride of other peninsular victories. It is a story of two extremes, a perfect and terrible microcosm of 19th century warfare. On one hand, it was perhaps the single greatest feat of cold steel in the entire Napoleonic Wars. The desperate courage of the Forlorn Hope, the suicidal bravery of the 3rd Division scaling the 100-foot castle walls with ladders, the sheer stubborn resilience of the Light Division charging again and again into a literal volcano of explosives and canister shot. This was the desperate courage of the British Redcoat at its absolute zenith. It was an exhibition of gallantry so profound that it moved its famously stoic commander to tears. But on the other hand, Badajoz represents the nadir of the army's conduct. The 72-hour sack was an act of such unrestrained depravity that it forever stained the army's reputation. It revealed the paper-thin veneer of discipline that separated a professional soldier from a feral mob. When Wellington famously remarked that his soldiers were the scum of the earth, enlisted for drink, it was the raw, unadulterated shame of Badajoz he was channeling. He knew that this instrument he wielded, this army of heroes that could storm an unbreachable fortress, was, in the next breath, capable of descending into a monster that murdered and raped its own allies. Strategically, however, the brutal calculation had been correct. The cost was horrific, but the prize was invaluable. By taking Badajoz, Wellington had secured his southern flank. He had punched the second eye out of the French defensive line, having already taken Ciudad Rodrigo. The twin fortresses that guarded the gates to Spain were now in his hands. The French armies of Marmont and Soult, which had been marching to relieve the fortress, were now forced to react to his movements. The initiative, for the first time, was firmly with Wellington. The road into Spain was open. This bloody, brutal, and shameful victory was the essential stepping stone to his greatest offensive campaign, which would culminate just a few months later in the war-turning masterpiece victory at the Battle of Salamanca. Ultimately, Badajoz is remembered as Wellington's bloodiest and most brutal siege because it was a victory that felt, in every human sense, like a catastrophic defeat. It was a tactical nightmare, a strategic necessity, and a moral disaster, all rolled into one. It is a stark reminder that the glory of the Redcoat era was often paid for by unimaginable slaughter, and that the line between the hero and the beast could be erased in a single night of gunpowder, blood, and rage. The walls of Badajoz were eventually repaired, but the scar of the breaches and the memory of the screams from within would haunt the conscience of the British Army forever. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please hit the like button, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments. We'll see you in the next video.